The moment Frederick Easton walked through the double doors of the Harlan Creek Saloon and Dance Hall on that warm October evening in 1882, every unmarried woman in the territory seemed to hold her breath at once, and not one of them could have guessed that, by the end of the night, it would be the quiet widow in the corner who would walk away with his heart. Harlan Creek was the kind of town that had grown up fast and stubborn along the banks of the Cimarron River in the Oklahoma Territory, the sort of place where the dust never fully settled and people knew each other's business before they knew their own. It had a general store run by a man named Horace Petty, who kept a ledger of every debt and a memory like a steel trap, a blacksmith named Cal Drummond who could bend iron and gossip with equal ease, a church that was half-finished but still hosted Sunday services under the open sky when the weather was kind, and a saloon that doubled as the town's social hall whenever the occasion called for it. Tonight, that occasion was the Harvest Dance, an annual tradition that brought everyone within 30 miles riding distance into town with their boots polished and their hearts open. Sadie Kendrick arrived early, which was her way. She came not because she expected to dance, not because she harbored any romantic notions about the evening, but because Mabel Trout, the preacher's wife, had asked her to help set out the food tables, and Sadie was not the kind of woman who refused a request made in good faith. She was 42 years old, fine-boned and tall, with dark hair that had begun to thread through with silver at the temples, and eyes the color of a river just after rain, that particular shade of gray-green that changed depending on the light. Her face held the kind of beauty that required patience to see, the sort that didn't announce itself loudly but rather revealed itself slowly, like a landscape you had to sit with for a while before you truly understood what you were looking at. She had been a widow for 3 years. Her husband, Thomas Kendrick, had been a good man, a rancher who worked hard and laughed easily, and died too young of a fever that swept through the valley the winter of 1879. He had left her with a modest spread of land 2 miles east of town, a small herd of cattle, a house that needed a new roof, and 2 sons. Eli, who was 20, had taken on the running of the ranch with the serious determination of someone twice his age, and Daniel, who was 17, helped when he wasn't being difficult about it, which was often enough. Sadie loved them both completely and without reservation, and the life she had built around that love was quiet and sufficient, if not particularly joyful. She was not unhappy. That was something she told herself on the harder evenings, when the house felt too large and too silent after supper. She was not unhappy. She simply was not expecting anything more from life than what she already had, which perhaps explained why she was entirely unprepared for Frederick Easton. She had heard his name before the dance, of course. You couldn't live in Harlan Creek and not have heard about Frederick Easton within 48 hours of his arrival. He had ridden into town 6 weeks prior, leading a pack horse, and trailing a reputation that had preceded him from 3 counties over. He was a cattleman and horse breeder. The story went, come down from Colorado after selling off a prosperous spread to a railroad company that had made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He was looking for new land, new possibilities, a fresh start in a territory that was still young enough to accommodate ambition. He was also, according to every woman who had laid eyes on him, devastatingly handsome in the particular way of men who spend their lives outdoors and have never once thought about it. Sadie had seen him briefly from across the street one afternoon when she was picking up supplies at Petty's store. She had noted him the way she noted any stranger, with a practical assessment and without lingering interest. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with deliberate intent. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was about and saw no reason to rush. She had thought briefly that he was probably younger than he looked, and then she had turned back to her list of supplies and forgotten him entirely. Or she had tried to forget him, which was perhaps not quite the same thing. The dance hall smelled of pine resin and beeswax candles, and the particular warm bread scent of people gathered in an enclosed space. Sadie had helped Mabel arrange the food table along the far wall. An impressive spread of cornbread and dried apple pie, and pickled things in jars, and roasted venison that Horace Petty's brother had contributed. The fiddle players were already tuning up in the corner, and children were chasing each other between the adults' legs until their mothers caught them by the collars and redirected their energy. Sadie took her place near the food table, which suited her. She could be useful there, refilling things and making sure the plates were arranged, and it gave her something to do with her hands, which she preferred to folding them in her lap and watching others dance. She was wearing her better dress, a deep blue wool that she had taken in slightly at the waist over the summer. With a white collar she had embroidered herself in small white flowers. She had pinned her hair up more carefully than usual, not because she expected anyone to notice, but because she had a sense of personal dignity that extended to public occasions regardless of the circumstances. The hall filled steadily. She recognized almost every face, the neighboring ranchers and their families, the shopkeepers and the men who worked the land, the young women who arrived in clusters, and immediately began scanning the room with the bright-eyed alertness of people who had come with a specific purpose in mind. She saw the Haverson girls, 3 of them, all rosy-cheeked and pretty in their best dresses. She saw Clara Briggs, who was considered the great beauty of the county at 23, with her copper hair and her confident smile. She saw young Agnes Drummond, who had just turned 19 and had been wearing her heart on her sleeve for 6 months over any man who crossed her path. The fiddles began in earnest, and the floor opened up. Frederick Easton arrived precisely when Sadie was refilling the cornbread platter, which meant her back was partially turned to the door, and she almost missed the particular quality of silence that preceded his entrance, that held-breath moment when the room seemed to pause and take stock of him before resuming its noise at a slightly higher pitch. She turned with the platter in her hands and saw him standing just inside the doorway, hat in hand, looking out over the room with an expression of calm, unhurried interest. He had cleaned up for the occasion, which was evident. His dark jacket sat well across his shoulders, his white shirt was fresh, and his boots had been polished to a gleam that caught the lantern light. He looked, Sadie thought, like a man entirely at ease in his own body, which was either a rare quality or a particularly convincing performance. The way several women in the room immediately straightened their postures and patted their hair suggested that others shared her assessment, though they were perhaps more enthusiastic about it than she was. She set the platter down and turned her attention back to the table. The fiddles played a reel, and couples took the floor. Sadie watched from her position near the food and found herself genuinely enjoying the music, tapping one foot quietly against the floorboards. She had always loved music, had grown up in a family where her father played the harmonica on Sunday evenings, and her mother sang in a clear, plain voice that carried through the house like light through glass. Thomas had not been a musical man, but he had been patient about it, sitting beside her on the porch while she hummed to herself in the evenings. She was thinking about Thomas, or rather she was doing that thing she sometimes did, where she brushed against the thought of him the way you might brush against a familiar piece of furniture in a dark room, recognizing it by texture, and then moving on, when she became aware that someone was standing at the other end of the food table. Frederick Easton was looking at the cornbread with the careful consideration of a man who had not eaten since morning, which, as it happened, was precisely the case. He reached out, took a piece, bit into it, and then his eyes moved down the length of the table and found her watching him. He did not look away. That was the first thing she noticed. Most people, when caught in the act of being observed, made some small performance of looking elsewhere, of pretending they hadn't been seen seeing. Frederick Easton simply looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, in a voice that was lower and quieter than she had expected, "This is the best cornbread I have eaten in approximately 4 months." Sadie felt something move in her chest, small and startled, like a bird that had been sitting still and suddenly decided to shift its wings. She kept her expression composed because she was a woman of considerable internal discipline and said, "Mabel Trout made that batch. You should tell her so." "I intend to," he said, "but I'm telling you first because you were here and she wasn't." He held out his hand across the table. "Frederick Easton." "I know who you are," Sadie said, not unkindly. "Word travels in Harlan Creek." "Then you have the advantage of me," he said, the hand still extended, patient, unhurried, not at all put off by her measured response. She took his hand and shook it the way she shook the hand of anyone she was meeting for the first time, firmly and briefly. "Sadie Kendrick." Something shifted in his expression, something she couldn't quite read. "Kendrick," he repeated. "Thomas Kendrick's widow." "Yes," she said simply. He nodded slowly. "I bought a horse from your elder son last month. Good animal, honest transaction." "Eli runs the ranch," she said. "He'd be pleased to hear you're satisfied." "I am," he said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, and then he took another piece of cornbread and looked out at the dancers. "Do you dance, Mrs. Kendrick?" "I used to," she said. "Used to," he repeated, as if tasting the phrase and finding it insufficient. "What happened to stop you?" She considered various answers and settled on the honest one. "Nothing happened. I simply stopped having occasion to." He looked at her then with an attention that was disconcerting in its steadiness and said, "That seems like a waste." He moved away then, drifting toward the edge of the dance floor where several people immediately claimed his attention, and Sadie found herself standing at the food table with a slightly elevated heart rate and the distinct sensation that she had been assessed by someone who took assessment seriously. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like Frederick Easton talked to everyone at a dance. That was simply what people did at dances, and she was there arranging food, and he was there eating it, and the conversation had been entirely ordinary. She picked up an empty jar and carried it to the back of the room and convinced herself, with moderate success, that she was not going to think about him again for the rest of the evening. She managed this for approximately 20 minutes. The fiddle players launched into a waltz, something slow and sweeping that changed the energy of the room from cheerful to romantic in the space of 4 bars. Sadie watched couples pair off, watched the young women she had noticed earlier begin to maneuver themselves into Frederick Easton's vicinity with varying degrees of subtlety. Clara Briggs reached him first, which surprised no one, and she said something to him with her copper-haired confidence that made him smile, though the smile did not reach his eyes. Sadie saw him look over Clara's shoulder, across the room, and find her. She looked away quickly, which was not her habit, and felt irritated with herself for doing it. She became absorbed in a conversation with Mabel Trout about the merits of various pie crusts, which was a subject on which Mabel had extensive and passionately held views, and she was genuinely engaged in this conversation, or at least genuinely present in it, when the music changed again, and she felt rather than saw someone stop beside her. "Mrs. Kendrick." Mabel Trout's eyes went wide. They went so wide that Sadie would remember it later as the first sign of what was coming, that startled, delighted, slightly scandalized expression that spread across Mabel's face like sunrise across a flat horizon. Sadie turned. Frederick Easton was standing there, hat no longer in hand because he'd set it somewhere, and he was looking at her with that same unhurried steadiness he'd had at the food table, and he said very simply, "Would you dance with me?" She felt the ripple move through the room before she had even processed the question. It was not a metaphor. She could actually feel it, the shift in attention, the turning of heads, the sudden alertness that spread outward from their position the way a stone drops into still water. In her peripheral vision, she could see Clara Briggs stop mid-sentence with the man she had been talking to. She could see the Haverson girls cluster together and whisper. She could see Agnes Drummond's face arrange itself into an expression of baffled disbelief. She looked at Frederick Easton and thought about saying no. She thought about it seriously and practically, the way she approached all decisions. She was 42 years old. He was, she guessed, somewhere in his mid-30s, perhaps 36 or 37, near enough in age to be reasonable but far enough that the difference was visible. She was a widow with 2 grown sons. She had dirt under her fingernails on days she didn't even work in the garden, simply because that was the nature of ranch life. She was not the kind of woman men asked to dance at harvest balls. And yet here was Frederick Easton asking. She said, yes, in a voice that was entirely steady, and felt distantly like she had stepped off a ledge she hadn't known she was standing on. He offered his hand and she took it, and they moved to the floor together, and behind them the room erupted in a whispered roar that Sadie could feel pressing against her back like wind. He danced well, which she had not expected, or rather she had not thought to form an expectation about it. But he moved with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything, and his hand was warm and sure at her waist, and he kept a proper distance between them, respectful and not performative about it. The music was a waltz, still, slow and 3-counted, and Sadie discovered after a few bars that her body remembered how to do this even though she had not done it in years. The entire room is looking at us, she said quietly, because she thought he should know in case he had somehow missed it. I know, he said, perfectly calm. That doesn't trouble you. Not particularly. Does it trouble you? She considered this honestly. I'm not sure yet, she said. He smiled at that, and this time it did reach his eyes, which were darker up close, almost black in the warm lantern light, with lines at the corners that came from squinting into sun and distance. That's the most honest answer anyone has given me to any question in longer than I can remember, he said. I find honesty more practical than its alternatives, she said. So do I, he said, though it makes people uncomfortable sometimes. Often, she agreed. They danced the full measure of the waltz, and when it ended they stood on the floor for a moment that was not quite long enough to be awkward, and then he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Kendrick," with a gravity that suggested he meant considerably more than the conventional expression. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Easton," with equal sincerity, and then she walked back toward the food table while the whispers rose behind her to a pitch that she suspected would be audible from the churchyard. Mabel Trout was waiting for her with both eyebrows raised so high they were in danger of departing her forehead entirely. "Sadie Kendrick," she said, in the voice of someone who has witnessed history being made and is not sure whether to be thrilled or alarmed. "What on earth?" "I danced," Sadie said calmly, and picked up a serving spoon. "He passed over every young woman in this room," Mabel said, lowering her voice to a whisper that still carried remarkably well. "Clara Briggs practically offered to carry him to the floor herself, and he walked right past her to you." "Mabel," Sadie said, "I'm not criticizing, I'm observing." "Your observation is noted," Sadie said, and smiled despite herself, which made Mabel's eyebrows climb even higher. On the other side of the room, she was acutely aware of Frederick Easton speaking with old Jim Halcourt about something that involved gestures indicating land and distance. But she was also aware, in that particular way that doesn't involve looking directly, that he glanced toward the food table more than once. The evening continued with the particular relentless energy of a harvest dance in full swing. The fiddles played reels and quadrilles and another waltz, and people drank the cider that had been fermenting since August, and the children, who had been supposed to be put to bed by 9, were still running circles around adult ankles at 10:30. The whispers about the dance Frederick Easton had chosen to share with Sadie Kendrick did not die down, but rather circulated and embellished themselves, as whispers in small towns always do, picking up details and implications as they passed from mouth to ear. Sadie heard some of them. She heard Clara Briggs say to her friend Nell something that included the words, "I cannot imagine what he was thinking," in a tone that was equal parts wounded dignity and genuine confusion. She heard one of the Haverson girls' fathers say to another man, in what he probably thought was a quiet voice, "Well, it's a strange choice, but then Easton's never been short on strange." She heard Agnes Drummond say, without malice but with the artless honesty of someone who has not yet learned to edit herself. But she's so much older. Sadie heard all of these things with the equanimity she had built over 42 years of living in a world where people said what they thought about women who failed to conform to expectation. She was not wounded by them. She was, if anything, mildly amused and also puzzled, because she had danced one dance with a man she had spoken to for perhaps 10 minutes total, and the room had responded as though she had done something genuinely shocking. She was thinking about this, turning it over in her mind like a stone looking for interesting insects, when Frederick Easton appeared at her elbow again, this time with 2 cups of cider and an expression of deliberate pleasantness. "I thought you might want this," he said, offering her a cup. She took it. "You're going to cause considerable more talk, Mr. Easton." "I suspect the talk is already well underway," he said, taking a comfortable position beside her at the edge of the room in the manner of a man who intended to stay a while. "I find I'm not particularly worried about it." "You're new here," she said. "The talk is easier to dismiss when you haven't been subject to it for 3 years." He turned to look at her then with a directness that required effort not to look away from. "What kind of talk has there been about you?" She shrugged one shoulder. "The usual, widow talk. Whether I'll sell the ranch, whether I can manage it, whether I'll remarry, whether I ought to." She sipped the cider. "Whether I'm managing my grief the right way, which seems to be a matter of great community interest." "And are you," he said, "managing it the right way?" She thought about Thomas, about the particular shape of missing someone you had known intimately, the way it changed over time from acute pain to a kind of background ache you got used to carrying. "I think I'm managing it my way," she said. "Which is the only way I know how." He nodded, and something in his expression shifted into something quieter and more considered. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Fever." "I understand something of what you mean." She looked at him, surprised, and then understood why she was surprised, because she had assumed, as people tended to assume about vital, handsome men, that they were uncomplicated by loss. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "Thank you," he said. "We were married 11 years. She was a remarkable woman." "Did you have children?" "A son," he said, and something brief and painful moved across his face. "He died the same year she did. He was 7. Sadie felt the particular resonance of that, the way one grief can find its corresponding frequency in another. She didn't say anything about silver linings or God's plan or any of the things people said when they meant well but fell short. She simply said, "That is a terrible weight to carry." "It is," he agreed, "though it gets lighter, slowly." They stood in companionable silence for a moment that was unusual between 2 people who had barely met, unusual in its comfort, its lack of social obligation, the way neither of them felt the need to fill it with noise. "Why did you ask me to dance?" she said finally. Not an accusation, not fishing for a compliment, just an honest question from a practical woman. He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated, because it meant he was going to answer honestly rather than quickly. "Because you were the only person in this room who looked like they were genuinely somewhere else in their mind," he said. "Like you were thinking about something real rather than performing at a dance. That interested me more than anything else I saw tonight." Sadie looked at him and felt the thing in her chest do that small, startled movement again, more sustained this time. She said, "That is either a very unusual observation or a very unusual line." "I have never been much for lines," he said. "They take too much energy and produce too little result." She laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh, short and genuine, and she saw his face change at it, something warming in those dark eyes, and she thought, with a clarity that was slightly alarming, that this man was going to be a complication. She did not know yet whether complications were what she needed or the very last thing she could afford. The dance wound down around midnight, as dances in Harlan Creek always did, with the older families gathering their children and the younger crowd reluctant to concede the evening. Sadie helped Mabel Trout cover the leftover food and stack the plates, and when she came back from retrieving her shawl from the hook near the door, she found Eli waiting for her outside with the wagon. his young face wearing the characteristic expression of someone who has heard things and is uncertain how to address them. "People are talking," he said as she climbed up onto the wagon seat. "People always talk," she said. "They're talking about you specifically." "I know." Eli was silent for a moment, the horses moving at a steady walk along the dark road east. The October air had gone cold and the stars were extraordinary, the whole sweep of the Milky Way spread out above them like something spilled and magnificent. "Did you dance with that Easton fellow?" he said finally. "Yes," she said, another silence. "Mama," he said and stopped. She waited. "He seems all right," Eli said at last. "The horse he bought was a fair transaction. He paid what we asked without haggling." Coming from Eli, who expressed approval rarely and in the most understated possible terms, this was a considerable endorsement. Sadie felt a warmth in her chest that was half amusement and half something else. "That's good to know," she said. "I just mean," Eli said and stopped again. He was very like Thomas in the way he approached difficult territory, sideways and carefully testing the ground. "I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying." "I know," she said gently. They rode the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence that people who live together develop over years, and Sadie sat under the vast Oklahoma sky and thought about dark eyes and the weight of grief getting lighter, and the particular sound of a low, unhurried voice saying things that were honest because they were too straightforward to be anything else. The following week, Frederick Easton rode out to the Kendrick ranch. He had a stated purpose, which was to inquire about a second horse, a matter he had mentioned to Eli after the dance in a brief conversation that Eli had reported to Sadie with the careful neutrality of someone who knew more than he was saying. He arrived on a Tuesday morning when the air was sharp and the cottonwoods along the river had gone entirely golden, and Sadie was in the yard splitting firewood when she heard the horse on the road. She did not pretend to be doing something more impressive than splitting wood, because she was a practical woman, and also because she was in the middle of a piece of log that required finishing. She completed the split and set the halves aside and turned to find him riding up, looking entirely at home on horseback in the way of men who had spent more of their lives in a saddle than out of one. He dismounted and walked toward her, leading the horse, and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Kendrick." "Good morning, Mr. Easton," she said, and leaned the axe against the woodpile. He glanced at the firewood. "You do that yourself?" "Most of the time," she said. "Eli helps when he's not occupied elsewhere, and Daniel when he can be persuaded." "I wouldn't have thought you'd need persuading on chores as a boy on a ranch," he said, not critically, just observationally. "Daniel is persuadable on some things," she said. "Firewood is not currently one of his enthusiasms." He smiled. She was beginning to catalog his smiles, she noticed, which was a thing she had not done in years and recognized as dangerous. "I came to look at a horse," he said. "Eli's out in the south pasture," she said. "I can walk you out." They walked together along the fence line toward the southern pasture, which was perhaps a quarter-mile from the house, and the walk was easy and unhurried, the conversation moving between practical things and less practical things with a naturalness that Sadie noted and tried not to make too much of. He asked about the ranch, about Thomas's original claim on the land, about how she had managed the transition of running it after his death. She answered directly because that was her way, and she asked him in return about his spread in Colorado, what it had been like to sell it, what he was looking for in Oklahoma territory. "Room," he said, "and something that feels new. Colorado was where my wife and I built everything. After she was gone, it started to feel like living inside something that had ended." "I understand that feeling," Sadie said, and she did. "I thought you might," he said. They reached the south pasture and found Eli, who regarded Frederick Easton with the careful assessment of a young man who has been asked without words to form an opinion and knows it. He showed him the horses with the seriousness and competence that made Sadie proud, explaining each animal's disposition and history with a knowledge that went beyond years, and Frederick Easton listened the way he did everything else, with full attention and without hurry. He purchased a second horse, a bay mare with a good disposition, and spent another 30 minutes talking with Eli about fencing methods and winter grazing practices, while Sadie stood near the fence and watched the cottonwoods move in the wind and found herself thinking, quietly and without drama, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have a conversation that asked something of her. When he left, he said goodbye to Eli first and then turned to her and said, "Thank you for the walk, Mrs. Kendrick." "You're welcome, Mr. Easton." He held her gaze for a moment and then said, with the straightforward simplicity that was apparently simply how he spoke, "I'll find an occasion to come back." She said, "I expect you will," and felt, after he had ridden away, the distinct sensation of someone standing very close to the edge of something, looking down into interesting depths. He found his occasion 3 days later, which was faster than she had expected and perhaps faster than was strictly appropriate. But his reason was practical enough on the surface. He had discovered a section of fence on the western property line of the parcel he was leasing that needed repair and wondered if Eli knew anyone who hired out for fencing work, since he was still new to the county and didn't know the local labor pool. He came with this question in the middle of the afternoon when Eli was in fact home, and the question was answered in approximately 4 minutes, and then he stayed for 2 hours. Daniel, who was 17 and observant and had not yet developed sufficient tact to manage what he observed, said at supper that evening with the unfiltered accuracy of the young, "That Easton man didn't come about fencing." Sadie looked at her plate. "He asked about the fence for about 5 minutes," Daniel continued, "and then sat on the porch talking to you for the rest of the time. I'm just making the observation." "Daniel," Eli said, in the older brother tone that communicated multiple things at once. "I'm not saying it's bad," Daniel said. "I'm just saying what I saw." Sadie looked up then and looked at her younger son, this boy who had Thomas's nose and her stubbornness, and entirely his own singular perspective on everything, and said, "What you saw is a man being neighborly." Daniel ate a bite of beef and said nothing for a moment, and then said, still without malice, entirely conversationally, "He looks at you the way Papa used to." The table went very quiet. Sadie felt the words land in her chest with a weight that was not unpleasant, but was not nothing. She thought of Thomas, of the way he had looked at her across rooms, that particular quality of attention that she had taken for granted while it was present and missed with a specific ache once it was gone. She cleared her throat and said, carefully, "That's an observation, Daniel, that you can keep to yourself in the future." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said, and went back to his supper with the unperturbed air of someone who has said what needed saying and is content. Frederick Easton found more occasions. He was not coy about it, and he was not aggressive about it. He simply showed up, with sufficient practical reasons that no one could object, and he stayed, and the conversations they had grew longer and deeper and more honest as October wound toward November, and the Oklahoma Territory turned its face toward winter. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, the youngest of 4 boys, his father a farmer who worked land that was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. He told her about coming west at 20 with $20, and a horse he had won in a card game, and the particular reckless optimism of someone who has not yet learned what there is to fear. He told her about meeting his wife, Margaret, in Colorado Territory, a woman who had come west with her family to homestead, and who had, he said, more courage in her smallest finger than most men carried in their whole bodies. He said her name, Margaret, with a quietness that told Sadie everything she needed to know about how he had loved her, the way you can hear the shape of a loss in the particular register of someone's voice. She told him things in return. She told him about growing up in Missouri, one of 6 children, her father a school teacher who believed in reading above almost everything. She told him about coming to the Oklahoma Territory with Thomas at 25, the first years when they had nothing except land and determination, and each other. She told him about the way Thomas laughed, that full-bodied laugh that had been the most recognizable sound of her domestic life, and she felt something ease in her chest as she spoke about him, the particular release of being able to speak about a person you've lost to someone who understands loss from the inside. Do you feel disloyal? Frederick asked her one afternoon when they were sitting on the porch in the thin November sun and she had been talking about Thomas. Speaking about him to me, she thought about it honestly. I did at first, she said. When you first started coming by, I thought, this is strange speaking to this man I barely know about my husband. But then I realized that you understand what it means to have loved someone and lost them. That changes the nature of it. It does, he said. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking out at the land, the brown November grass and the bare cottonwoods and the pale sky. I think sometimes people who haven't lost a spouse don't quite understand that loving someone again doesn't diminish the first love. They think it has to be either or. And you don't think that. No, he said simply. I think the heart is larger than that. She looked at him sideways, this man who had arrived in her life with the unhurried certainty of weather, and thought that he was either the most genuine person she had encountered in years or an extraordinarily convincing performance of one, and she was increasingly certain it was the former. Frederick, she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw him notice it, the brief attention in his eyes. What are you doing? He turned to look at her directly. I would have thought that was becoming clear, he said. I would like you to say it clearly, she said, because I am not a person who does well with implication. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive but thoughtful, choosing his words with the care of someone who means them. I am courting you, Sadie, he said, using her given name with an ease that told her he had been waiting for permission to do it. If you're willing to be courted, and if you're not, I'd rather know now, because I find that my preference for your company is growing steadily, and I would like to know whether it has somewhere to go. The directness of it took her breath away slightly, not because it was forward, but because she had forgotten that people could simply say true things to each other without arrangement or performance. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land that Thomas had worked and that Eli was now working and that she had built 20 years of her life around. She thought about the things that were real and the things that were complicated and the difference between being cautious and being afraid. I am 42 years old, she said. I know how old you are, he said, without impatience. I have 2 sons who are grown or nearly grown. I have a ranch that requires my full attention. I am not, she paused, finding the words. I am not the same person I was at 25 when I came here with Thomas. I am considerably more set in my ways and considerably less willing to accommodate foolishness of any kind. Those all sound like advantages to me, he said, rather than arguments against. She looked at him. He was entirely serious. She felt something in her chest that was not quite ready to be named, but was warm and real and considerably more present than anything she had felt in 3 years. She said, "You are an unusual man, Frederick Easton." "I've been told," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am willing to be courted." The smile that moved across his face was different from the others she had catalogued, wider and less restrained and entirely without calculation. And it did something to the whole arrangement of his face that made him look younger and considerably more vulnerable than he ever seemed. And Sadie thought, with a clarity that was no longer alarming, that she was in considerable trouble of the best possible kind. The winter came in earnest that December, the first real snow falling on the 14th and settling seriously over the Oklahoma territory with the particular weight of a season that intends to stay a while. Frederick Easton had by December secured a lease on a proper piece of land 7 miles from the Kendrick Ranch, a good parcel with reliable water access and solid fencing on 3 sides, and he had begun building a house on it with the help of 2 men he'd hired from town, a straightforward, well-proportioned structure that said something about the person building it, functional and honest and built to last. He rode over to the Kendrick Ranch when weather permitted, which it didn't always, and on the days it didn't there were letters, which was a thing Sadie had not anticipated and which affected her more than the visits in some ways, because Frederick Easton wrote the way he spoke, directly and without performance, and his letters were full of things he observed and thought about and wondered, and they made her feel, in the solitude of the cold ranch house evenings, that she was in genuine conversation with someone who found her genuinely interesting, which was a feeling she had almost forgotten existed. She wrote back. She had always been a competent writer, her father's daughter in that, and she found the letters easier in some ways than conversation. The way writing gives you time to say what you actually mean rather than what comes first. She wrote about the ranch and the winter and Daniel's ongoing adventures in avoiding homework, and she wrote about the books she was reading. There was a traveling library that came through Harlan Creek once a month, a remarkable institution, and she was working her way through a collection of essays that she found stimulating. And Frederick wrote back that he had read the same author in Colorado and thought the third essay in particular was the best one, which led to a whole correspondence about reading and the particular pleasure of ideas, which was the kind of conversation Sadie had not had in years and which felt, she thought, like water after a long dry stretch. Christmas came. Harlan Creek celebrated it with the particular communal warmth of isolated places, a church service under the now completed half of the church roof, and a gathering afterward at the Petty house, where Horace Petty's wife, a round, generous woman named Florence, produced an improbable quantity of food and pressed it on everyone who came through the door. Sadie came with Eli and Daniel. Frederick Easton came alone and arrived at the party to find the general community in the slightly rearranged social configuration that his courtship of Sadie Kendrick had produced over the past 2 months. The town, it had to be said, had opinions. Most of the women who had been at the Harvest Dance had processed their initial shock and moved into a range of subsequent reactions. Clara Briggs had managed it with the most grace, declaring to anyone who asked that she thought it was lovely, in a tone that was convincing enough to be accepted but contained enough distance to be safe. The Haverson girls had simply shifted their attentions to other prospects, of which Harlan Creek always produced enough. Agnes Drummond was the most vocal holdout, finding the whole situation somewhere between baffling and offensive, and she said so to enough people that it became a kind of minor social current. The men of the town were in some ways more interesting. The older ones, the married ranchers and the shopkeepers and the men who had known Thomas Kendrick, watched the development with a cautious approval that was not entirely free of scrutiny. Thomas had been one of their own and Sadie was one of their own, and Easton was still relatively new and therefore subject to the provisional trust that small communities extend to newcomers, sufficient enough to function on, contingent on continued good behavior. Old Jim Halcourt, who was 71 and had been in the territory since before there was much of a territory to speak of, told Frederick Easton directly, and without preamble at the Christmas gathering, that Sadie Kendrick was a good woman who had done right by her family and her land, and deserved to be treated accordingly, and that Jim would be watching. He said this in the tone of someone delivering information rather than a threat, but the distinction was perhaps academic. Frederick received it with the same equanimity he received most things. "That's fair," he said to Jim, which was perhaps the only possible response, and Jim nodded and returned to his cider. Sadie witnessed this exchange from across the room and felt a warmth that was not uncomplicated. She had not asked anyone to vet Frederick Easton on her behalf, and she was a woman capable of making her own assessments, but there was something in the gesture that she recognized as genuine care, even when it was expressed in the particular blunt style of frontier men who don't have a word for affection, but acted out in territory marking and warning looks, and the stubborn maintenance of community standards. She told Frederick about it later, as they stood together near the window with cups of Florence Petty's excellent spiced tea and watched the snow falling outside, and he laughed, genuinely and freely, the kind of laugh that transformed his face entirely. "I have now been warned by Jim Halcourt," he said, "which I suspect means I have been accepted into the community on some level, since he wouldn't bother warning someone he had already dismissed." "That's a very generous interpretation," she said. I find generous interpretations more useful than suspicious ones, he said. He looked at her sideways, the way he sometimes did when he was about to say something he had thought about. Your sons haven't warned me. No, she said. Eli watches me, he said, not as a complaint, just as an observation. He's deciding what he thinks. He decides things slowly, Sadie said, like his father, but once he decides, he doesn't change his mind. And Daniel, she smiled despite herself. Daniel told me last week that he thought you were the most interesting man who had been to the ranch since the circuit preacher 3 years ago who claimed to have eaten rattlesnake. Frederick looked delighted. That's either a high compliment or a very low bar. With Daniel, it's always both, she said. They stood together in Florence Petty's warm parlor and watched the snow come down outside the frosted window, and Sadie felt, with a clarity that had been building for weeks, that she was happy. Not the quiet, sufficient happiness of managing a good life, but something more alive than that, something that had edges and warmth and the particular quality of anticipation. She had forgotten what it felt like to look forward to things. She was remembering. On New Year's Eve, with the year 1882 giving way to 1883, Frederick rode over to the Kendrick Ranch in the cold and brought a bottle of good whiskey that he had been saving for an occasion. And Eli and Daniel were both at home, and they sat around the kitchen table and drank a small cup each and talked for 3 hours about everything that came to mind. And somewhere in the middle of it, with the fire burning low and Daniel having fallen asleep in his chair, Eli looked at Frederick Easton across the table with those assessing, careful eyes and said, "You're serious about her?" It was not a question. "Yes," Frederick said. Eli looked at him for a long moment with the weight of a young man who has been carrying more responsibility than his age warranted for 3 years and knows the cost of things. "She's been through enough," he said. "She makes it look easy, but it hasn't been." "I know," Frederick said quietly. "I'm not saying don't," Eli said. He looked at his hands on the table, big, capable hands already roughened by the work of the ranch. "I'm saying do it right," Frederick nodded. "That's what I intend." Eli met his eyes again, and something passed between them. One of those wordless agreements that occasionally occur between men who understand what matters and don't need excessive language to say so. Then Eli looked at his mother and looked back at Frederick and said, in a tone that was gruff and genuine in equal measure, "She laughs more when you're here. She hasn't laughed like that in a while." Sadie was looking at the fire and pretending she hadn't heard this, though she had heard every word, and she felt the warmth in her chest expand to something almost overwhelming, the particular emotion that comes from being loved well by your children, who see you clearly and love you anyway, and sometimes in their plain, undecorated way say the most accurate things. January and February were the hardest months, cold enough to keep people close to home and sometimes close to their fires for days at a time. Frederick and Sadie's courtship adapted itself to the constraints of winter with the resourcefulness of 2 practical people. The letters continued and sometimes increased. When the weather cleared sufficiently, he rode over, or she rode over to his property, where the house was taking shape despite the cold, the walls up and the roof on and the inside still rough, but coming together with the particular orderly progress of someone who knows what they're building and has thought carefully about how to build it. She noticed the way he had designed it. There was a large kitchen, practical and well lit, with room for a proper table. There was a porch on the south side that would catch the afternoon light. There were bookshelves built into the wall of what he called the sitting room, real bookshelves, not an afterthought, integrated into the design from the beginning. She stood in the half-finished room looking at those shelves and felt something move through her that she could not have explained to anyone who hadn't been looking for exactly that particular thing in exactly that particular person. He came to stand beside her. "I thought shelves would be useful," he said. "For books," she said. "That was the intention," he said. She looked at him. "You built shelves into the plans before you knew whether anyone would live here who wanted books." "I wanted books," he said, And I thought if someone came to live here who didn't want books, that might be a useful indication that the match was wrong. The simplicity of it, the completeness of it as a statement of what mattered to him, made her eyes fill briefly, which surprised her, because Sadie Kendrick was not a woman who cried easily. She turned her face away and blinked it back, and he let her, which was another thing she was cataloging, the way he understood when to let a moment breathe and when to move through it. "Sadie," he said after a moment. "Yes," she said, still looking at the shelves. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said, "when you're ready. I'm not asking you right now because I don't want to rush you and because I'm not sure the house is ready to be asked into yet. But I wanted you to know that is the direction I'm moving in, so you can tell me if it's the wrong direction." She turned to look at him then, this man who had ridden into her life with his dark eyes and his unhurried certainty and his built-in bookshelves. And she thought about 42 years and 3 years of widowhood and 2 sons and a ranch and the particular shape of a life that has been thoroughly lived and is perhaps, improbably, not yet finished with its interesting developments. She said, "It is not the wrong direction." He exhaled, a small, careful exhale, and she understood that he had not been as certain as he appeared, that the steadiness he carried was not the absence of feeling but the management of it, and that understanding made her feel something for him that was both tender and profound. Spring came back to the Oklahoma territory the way it always did, loudly and with excess, the creek rising and the grass coming in overnight, and every living thing suddenly insisting on itself. Sadie watched the cottonwoods leaf out from her kitchen window and felt the season as a kind of permission, the way spring has always felt in places where winter is serious, like a loosening of something held too tight. Frederick's house was finished by April. He had been living in it in its rougher stages since February, which was somewhat austere but manageable for a man accustomed to managing. And by April it was genuinely complete, with real furniture he had bought from the cabinet maker in town, and the kitchen stocked, and the bookshelves beginning to accumulate volumes. He had 2 ranch hands by then, good men named Santos and Pete, who lived in the bunkhouse he'd built near the barn, and the operation had the look of something solid and well considered. On a Tuesday evening in May, when the sky over the Oklahoma territory was the extraordinary shade of blue that only exists at dusk in open country, Frederick rode over to the Kendrick ranch and tied his horse at the post and came to the door and asked Sadie if she would walk with him, which was something they did sometimes in the evenings when the weather was kind. They walked along the fence line to the south, where the grass was coming in green and thick, and the air smelled of wild onion and warm earth and the particular perfume of the territory in spring. And when they had walked far enough to be away from the house and its windows, he stopped and turned to face her. He took both her hands in his. His hands were warm and large and certain, and she looked up at him in the blue dusk and saw in his face something that she recognized, because she had seen it in Thomas's face in a different version, and in her own mirror in its most recent iteration, the look of someone about to say something that is entirely real. "I love you, Sadie Kendrick," he said. "I have been working toward that sentence for 6 months, and I want you to know that I have weighed it carefully, and I mean every word of it. I love the way you think and the way you speak and the way you laugh and the way you are with your sons, and the way you have survived things that would have felled most people and are still, somehow, open to more. I would like to spend the rest of my life in your company, if you're willing, and I'm asking you now to marry me." He did not produce a ring, because this was not that kind of proposal, or rather he produced it only afterward from his jacket pocket, a simple gold band with a small pattern of leaves pressed into the metal, which he had made by the goldsmith in the next county over and which was very like what she would have chosen for herself, simple and well-made and not performative. Sadie stood in the dusk and looked at the man who had walked into her life with the certainty of weather, and asked her to dance in front of a whole scandalized town, and written her letters about ideas, and built bookshelves into his house before he knew she existed, and understood grief from the inside, and loved her with the particular completeness of someone who had lived enough to know what they were doing. She said, "I love you, Frederick Easton," and felt the truth of it settle into her body like something that had always been there and was only now being named. And yes, he put the ring on her finger and then he kissed her, which was the first time they had kissed, because they had both been deliberate about that, understanding that there are things that once begun are difficult to stop. And the kiss was everything that 6 months of careful courtship had been building toward, warm and real and entirely unhurried, and the Oklahoma Territory spread out around them in its vast blue dusk and did not judge them at all. They told the boys that evening, coming back to the house hand in hand, which told Eli and Daniel most of what they needed to know before either adult said a word. Daniel, who was 17 and had been right about things since November, said, "Finally," in a tone of profound relief, which made everyone laugh, including Sadie, who pressed her hand to her mouth and felt the laughter come up from somewhere very deep and warm. Eli shook Frederick's hand with the formal seriousness of someone completing an agreement that had been under negotiation for some time, and then he did something he almost never did. He hugged his mother, quick and fierce, and she held him and thought about Thomas and thought about the way life continues to produce things you did not expect, and was grateful. The wedding was set for June, which gave the town of Harlan Creek approximately 6 weeks to have whatever opinions it intended to have and process them to a conclusion before the actual event. The opinions, predictably, were extensive. It was not that the town was unkind. Harlan Creek was, by the standards of the territory and the era, a reasonably decent community, the kind of place where people pulled together in crisis and looked after their own and generally meant well even when they expressed it badly. But it was also a small place with limited entertainment and a considerable appetite for the domestic dramas of its members, and the prospect of Frederick Easton, who had arrived in October as the most sought-after eligible man in the county, marrying Sadie Kendrick, the quiet widow at the food table, was simply too interesting not to be discussed at length. Clara Briggs, who had by this point moved on to a genuine romantic interest in a young lawyer who had come to town in February, managed perfect social graciousness. She congratulated Sadie at the general store one morning in a genuine and unforced way, and Sadie thanked her, and they had a brief and pleasant conversation about the lawyer, and left on better terms than they had been on since October, which was perhaps the most realistic possible outcome. Agnes Drummond remained the most vocal dissenter, saying to anyone who would listen, which was fewer and fewer people as the weeks went on, that she still didn't understand it and thought Easton could have done much better for himself, which Mabel Trout, who had by now appointed herself Sadie's unofficial champion, addressed with a directness that reportedly left Agnes briefly speechless. Mabel Trout was not a large woman, but she was formidable when she decided something was worth being formidable about. Jim Halcourt told Frederick the week before the wedding that he was satisfied, which Frederick received with the same quiet seriousness as the original warning, and which was, Sadie thought when he told her about it, one of the most touching things she had heard in a while. The wedding took place on a Saturday morning in June under a sky that was enormous and blue and entirely without clouds, which the Oklahoma Territory occasionally produced, as though to remind you what it was capable of when it was being generous. The ceremony was held in the now fully roofed church, which had only recently received its windows, and was officiated by the circuit preacher, a cheerful, wind-burned man named Reverend Alcott, who married and buried and baptized across 3 counties and brought genuine enthusiasm to all of it. Sadie wore a dress that she and Mabel had made together, a pale gray silk that she had found in the bulk goods at Petty's store, elegant and simple, with small buttons at the wrists, and a collar that she had embroidered herself in the same small white flowers as her best dress. She had her hair pinned up and had allowed Mabel to add a small ivory comb that had been Mabel's mother's, which Mabel pressed on her with such earnest generosity that refusing would have been impossible and ungrateful. Eli walked her down the aisle, which was his idea, offered quietly and without drama a week before the wedding, and she had taken his arm with a fullness of heart that she couldn't entirely express. Daniel walked ahead of them and sat in the front pew and watched the proceedings with the alert attention of someone recording something they intend to remember, which was very like him. Frederick was already at the altar when she came through the church doors, standing with the same straight, settled quality he always had, and when he saw her come in his face, did that thing she had catalogued at the Christmas party and not yet forgotten, that widening into something warmer and less managed than his usual expression, and it was the most eloquent thing she had ever seen him do. The ceremony was short and genuine. When Reverend Alcott asked if anyone objected, the church was entirely silent, which was perhaps a tribute less to the absence of objection, and more to the fact that even those who had objected understood that their moment had passed, and the thing was going forward regardless. When Frederick said "I do," he said it in his quiet, certain voice that Sadie had come to understand meant he had thought carefully about what he was saying and intended every word. When she said "I do," she meant it in every direction, forward and backward and deep, the whole accumulated weight of who she was and what she had lived through and what she was choosing now. They were married at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the town came to the reception at the Petty house, where Florence Petty had outdone herself in a manner that would be referenced in Harlan Creek for years afterward. There was food enough for twice the number of people present and music from the same fiddle players as the Harvest Dance, and dancing on the same floor where, 8 months prior, the whole room had gasped to see Frederick Easton walk past every young woman in the room to ask Sadie Kendrick to dance. They danced again, of course. The same waltz or one like it, and this time it was different in every way that mattered. There was no room gasping, or rather the room gasped in a different register, the warm, slightly emotional sound of people witnessing something that has resolved into exactly what it should be. Sadie stood in the circle of her husband's arm, Frederick Easton, who had built bookshelves and written letters and said true things, and she thought that life was, if you let it, larger than any set of expectations you arrived at it with. Mabel Trout cried openly and was not ashamed of it. Jim Halcourt watched from his chair by the wall with an expression of compressed approval. Eli danced one set with Agnes Drummond's older sister and managed to look mildly pleased about it. Daniel ate an extraordinary quantity of pie and then fell asleep in his chair exactly as he had done on New Year's Eve, which made Frederick look over at Sadie and smile, and she smiled back, and between the two of them it was an entire conversation. They spent their first night at Frederick's house, which was now their house, and Sadie walked through it in the evening light and stood in the sitting room and looked at the bookshelves, which already held her books mixed in with his, the spines pressed together in the companionable way of books that belong to the same household, and she thought that happiness was so often found in the things you hadn't been looking for, the second waltz when the first one changes everything. The man who builds shelves for a woman he hasn't met yet, the life that continues past the point where you thought it had said its most interesting things. The summer of 1883 was warm and full and busy. There was the ranch to run, both ranches now, because Sadie and Frederick made the practical decision that Eli would continue to manage the Kendrick land and Frederick would run his own operation, with cooperation and shared resources between the two properties, which suited everyone. Eli was developing into a genuinely excellent rancher, steady and knowledgeable and increasingly confident in his judgments, and working alongside Frederick gave him access to a different fund of experience that he drew on with the quiet eagerness of someone who learns by watching good examples. Daniel presented his own ongoing adventure. He was, that summer, a boy in the process of becoming something, not yet certain what, with a restless intelligence that ran in too many directions to have settled yet on its destination. He helped on the ranch with the intermittent enthusiasm of someone who knows the work matters, but isn't convinced it's his particular calling. He read everything he could get his hands on, which Frederick quietly encouraged by adding to the household library at regular intervals. He had strong opinions about nearly everything and the confidence to state them, which made for lively supper conversations and occasional exasperation. That fall, Frederick enrolled Daniel in a proper school in the county seat, a 2-day ride but worth the distance for the education it offered, and Daniel went with the combination of indignation and suppressed excitement that characterized most of his attitudes toward new things. He came home for Christmas and talked for 3 days straight about everything he was learning and everyone he had met, and Frederick listened with genuine attention and asked thoughtful questions and afterward told Sadie privately that the boy had a first-rate mind and deserved the best education the territory could offer. Sadie, who had always known this about Daniel but had not always had the means to act on it, felt a gratitude for this that she did not express directly, because she and Frederick had an understanding that gratitude between them was too close to obligation, and they preferred a different vocabulary. Instead, she took his hand at the supper table and pressed it briefly, and he understood. By the second Christmas of their marriage, with 1884 settling in around them, Sadie knew she was pregnant. She was 43 years old, and the news arrived with a complexity of feeling that she had not anticipated, because she had not anticipated the possibility, had set it aside as a thing that belonged to earlier years and was no longer relevant. She sat with the knowledge for 2 weeks before she said anything, turning it over in her mind with the particular thoroughness she brought to things that required careful handling. She told Frederick on an evening in January when the snow was deep outside and the fire was high and they were sitting together in the sitting room, she with a book and he with the week's accounts, in the comfortable domestic companionship that was one of the things she loved best about the life they had built. She simply said his name, and when he looked up, she told him. She watched his face go through a sequence of things: surprise, calculation, a brief complicated passage that she recognized as something related to the son he had lost, and then something that opened in his expression like a window, warm and full and certain. He set the accounts aside and came to sit beside her and took her hands and looked at her with everything he had and said, "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "I am very all right, I think, though I am also 43 and aware of what that means." "Are you frightened?" She thought about it honestly. "Somewhat," she said. "Are you?" "Somewhat," he said. "And also, Sadie." He stopped and his voice was a different quality than usual, rougher, more exposed. "Also incredibly grateful." She put her hand against his face, which was something she did sometimes, the directness of it communicating things that words were insufficient for, and he turned his face slightly into her palm the way he always did, a small, involuntary gesture that she had come to treasure, because it was the most unguarded thing he did, and they sat together in the firelight while the snow fell outside and understood that their life was still producing things they hadn't expected. She was careful through the pregnancy with the practical intelligence of a woman who has done this before and knows what matters. She kept working but with modifications, accepting help without the stubbornness that had characterized her widowhood, because Frederick was there and Eli was nearby, and even Daniel, home for a summer visit, was surprisingly willing to take on extra tasks when he understood why. The town of Harlan Creek, which had processed its way from scandal to acceptance to the particular warm proprietary feeling that small communities develop about the significant events of their members, received the news of the pregnancy with a burst of enthusiasm that produced more visits and more contributions of food and advice than Sadie strictly needed, but accepted with good grace. Mabel Trout was beside herself with delight. She told anyone who would listen that she had known from the beginning that it would be a good match, which was a creative revision of her original wide-eyed Sadie Kendrick. What on earth? But Sadie let it stand, because Mabel's heart was enormous even when her memory was selective. The baby was born in October, which brought things full circle in a way that Sadie noticed and Frederick marked later in a letter he wrote to her. A habit he had kept even after they were married because he liked the act of writing to her, and she liked receiving it. The baby was a boy, which made Daniel, who had been petitioning the universe for a brother, loudly triumphant, and which made Eli quietly, deeply pleased in the way he was pleased about things he felt strongly. Frederick held his son for the first time in the low October light of the bedroom, and his face held an expression that was entirely private, the particular inwardness of someone having an experience that belongs only to them, and Sadie watched him from the pillow and felt the fullness of the moment with every part of herself. They named him James Thomas Easton. James for Frederick's father and Thomas for the man who had come before, because Frederick had suggested it and Sadie had felt the generosity of it as something that required a moment of quiet to receive. It was, she thought, a thing that only someone who understood grief with genuine intimacy could offer, the acknowledgement that love is not competitive, that the people who came before are part of the fabric of who you are and need not be diminished to make room for what comes next. James was, from the beginning, a cheerful and determined presence. He had dark hair like his father and the gray-green eyes that ran in the Kendrick line, and a laugh that was Sadie's father's laugh reproduced across 2 generations, full and unself-conscious and entirely charming. He grew with the rapid, astonishing pace of small children and filled the house with noise and energy, and the particular mess of someone discovering that the world is interesting and requires investigation. Eli came over most Sundays and could be found with James on his knee, telling him things about horses with the serious, patient tone of someone conducting genuine instruction, which made Sadie's heart do complicated things. Daniel came home for longer stretches as he advanced in school, and showed an affinity for law that surprised no one who had been paying attention to the precision with which he had always argued everything. He was 19 now, Daniel, no longer a boy in any practical sense, and he was becoming interesting in new ways, developing the particular quality of someone who has found the channel his energy is meant to run in. He took the bar examination in the spring of 1886 after completing his studies, and passed it with marks that his examiner found remarkable. He set up a practice in the county seat, which was becoming a proper town by then, and sent his mother a letter that she kept in the tin box where she kept the important things, a letter that said, among other things, "I would not be here except for you, and for Frederick, who told me that a mind like mine was worth the investment. Please tell him I said so, because you know I find it difficult to say it directly." Sadie gave the letter to Frederick and watched him read it, and his expression was the quiet, moved expression of someone who has done a good thing and is being told so. And she thought that love was sometimes also this, being part of someone's growth without making it about yourself, and that Frederick Easton did it without effort or performance. The years moved the way good years do, with the specific quality of time that is full and meaningful but doesn't drag, each season bringing its own character and its own events. The ranches prospered. The territory was changing around them, pressing toward statehood with the accumulated weight of population and commerce, and the complex political negotiations of a place that was simultaneously ancient and new. The people who had lived there before the settlers, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, and the other nations who had been pressed onto the designated Indian Territory by the relentless machinery of federal policy, faced a continuing series of injustices that Frederick and Sadie both saw clearly, even if there was little they could do against the tide of a system that was larger than their choices. Frederick dealt fairly and honestly with every person he encountered regardless of origin, which was not a universal standard in the territory and mattered more than it perhaps appeared, and Eli, who traded horses and cattle across a wide territory, carried the same standard, which he had learned from his mother long before Frederick arrived. James grew. He was walking before a year was out, talking before 18 months, asking questions before 2 years with the relentless curiosity of someone who has arrived in a world they find extremely interesting and want to understand thoroughly. By 3, he was following his father around the property with the solemn intentness of an apprentice, and Frederick brought him along for everything that was safe to bring him along for, teaching him the names of things and the reasons behind them with the same patient attention he brought to all his endeavors. Sadie watched them together, her husband and their small son, in the evening light of the ranch yard or in the barn or out along the fence line, and she thought about the things life holds that you don't see coming, the good things that arrive without announcement and change the whole shape of what you thought was already complete. She was 45 now, and she knew with a certainty that required no further analysis, happier than she had been at any previous point in her life. Not the giddy happiness of youth, which she remembered as bright and brief and somewhat exhausting, but something deeper and more stable, the happiness of someone who knows what they have and has chosen it with full understanding. She told Frederick this one evening in the summer of 1886, sitting on the south-facing porch that caught the afternoon light, which was where they tended to end up after supper when the weather was good. James was asleep inside, worn out by a day of energetic investigation, and the ranch was quiet in the particular way of summer evenings, the crickets and the distant cattle and the wind in the grass, and the sky was going through its extraordinary evening colors over the flat horizon. She said, "I want you to know that I am happy, not just content but genuinely, specifically happy, and that it has everything to do with you." He was quiet for a moment, which was his way when something landed that he wanted to receive properly. Then he said, "So am I, Sadie, in ways I didn't think were still available to me." She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had walked through a door on October evening in 1882 and seen her standing at a food table thinking about something real. And she thought about the whole of it, the dance and the waltz and the letters and the bookshelves and the winter and the spring and the wedding and James and all of it. And she thought that it was one of the great privileges of being human that you could look back at the string of events that constituted your life and see, if you were lucky, how each thing connected to the next with a logic that had not been visible at the time. The harvest dance came around again in the fall, as it always did, the annual gathering that marked both the end of the working season and the beginning of winter, and the Eastons came together, Sadie and Frederick and James, who was not quite 2 and was carried in Frederick's arms for most of the evening with the wide-eyed attentiveness of a child experiencing something large and loud for the first time. Eli came, looking like a young man who has settled into his life with satisfaction, broad-shouldered and serious and quietly pleased about things. Daniel came too, home for the occasion from the county seat. Already carrying himself with the beginning of the professional bearing, he was developing and full of opinions about territorial politics that he shared with anyone willing to engage. The hall was full and warm and loud, and the fiddles played with the same enthusiastic competence they had brought to every harvest dance since Sadie could remember, and couples took the floor and children ran in circles, and the table along the far wall was laden with food exactly as it had been 2 years prior. Sadie stood not at the food table this time, but in the middle of the floor with her husband's hand in hers, and they danced the first waltz together in front of everyone in the community, in front of Clara Briggs, who had married her lawyer and was visibly pregnant, in front of the Haverson girls who had each found their own conclusions to their romantic stories, in front of Jim Halcourt, who watched from his chair with the compressed approval that was the fullest expression of his emotional range, and in front of Mabel Trout, who cried, as she always did now at events involving the Eastons, with the generous emotional openness of someone who feels entirely vindicated. Sadie danced and thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, standing at the food table with her serving spoon, telling herself that quiet sufficiency was enough and meaning it, and also not meaning it in the deepest possible sense. She thought about how it had taken a man with dark eyes and an unhurried manner, and a complete indifference to what the room thought of him to walk straight past every available option and ask the woman who wasn't expecting anything to dance. She looked up at Frederick, who was looking at her with the expression that was still, after 2 years, the warmest thing she had ever seen on a human face, and she thought that the whole town could gasp all it wanted. Some things were simply true regardless of whether they conformed to what anyone expected, and what was true here, in this hall and in this marriage, and in the life they had built with such deliberate and genuine care, was that love did not follow the rules people tried to impose on it. It found its own level. It chose its own timing. And it arrived when it arrived at all, with the quiet certainty of something that had been looking for exactly this and had, at last, found it. She would remember the dance the way you remember the best things, not as a single image but as a series of small true details. The warmth of his hand, the fiddle melody curving through the air, James asleep in Eli's arms by the far wall because he had finally exhausted himself, Daniel arguing good-naturedly with Jim Halcourt about something political and losing cheerfully, and Frederick looking at her as though she was the most interesting thing he had seen in all his years of looking at a wide and varied world. James Easton grew up on the land between 2 ranches that eventually became one. When Eli formally joined his operation to his stepfather's in 1889, the year Oklahoma Territory pushed harder toward its eventual statehood. 2 properties run with the combined intelligence and capability of 3 generations of people who knew what they were doing. He grew up knowing the names of stars and horses and the best methods for reading weather in an open sky, and he grew up with a library of books that lined 2 full walls of the sitting room, and that his mother had been adding to since before he was born. And he grew up understanding, because it was demonstrated daily in the particular quality of attention his parents brought to their life together, what it looked like to love someone with honesty and completeness, and without performance. Daniel practiced law with the sharp, principled intelligence that had been his from childhood, and he came home enough and wrote enough that the distance never felt like absence. He married in 1890, a woman named Ruth who was as direct and clear-minded as Daniel himself, which was perhaps the only kind of person who could have satisfied him, and they brought her to the ranch that summer, and Frederick sat across the supper table from his stepson and his stepson's wife and felt, with the fullness of a man who has come through losses and emerged somewhere he did not expect but is deeply glad to be, that the world contained more good things than grief would ever let you believe at its worst moments. Eli never married, which was his own choice and no one questioned it. He was complete in himself and in his work, and he was uncle to James with a consistency and warmth that James would carry with him all his life as one of the essential certainties of his childhood. The ranch was Eli's in every meaningful sense, and he ran it with a competence that Thomas Kendrick, watching from whatever distance the dead observed the living, would have recognized as everything he had hoped for. In the fall of 1890, when the Harvest Dance came around again with its reliable fiddles and its lantern light and its particular smell of beeswax and warm humanity, Sadie and Frederick danced together as they had done every year since the one that started everything. And James, who was 6 by then and had opinions about everything including music, stood on the edge of the floor and watched his parents with the solemn attention of a child studying something important. Afterward, walking home under the October stars, James between them with a hand in each of their hands, Frederick looked up at the sky and said, quietly, "I'm glad I walked into that dance." Sadie looked at him and then looked up at the same sky, the same vast, ordinary, extraordinary Oklahoma Territory sky that had been above everything, the courting and the wedding and the birth and the years, and she said, "So am I." James looked up too, because his parents were looking up and he wanted to see what they saw, and the 3 of them stood on the dark road for a moment with the stars and the crickets and the wide country all around them. And it was one of those moments that you recognize even as it is happening, that comes with its own quiet acknowledgement of its own value, that says, without words, this is it. This is what it was for all of it. They walked home together, the lantern Frederick carried swinging its small circle of warmth against the dark. And behind them, Harlan Creek settled into its evening quiet with the satisfied stillness of a town that has seen enough of its own story to understand that the most interesting chapters are not always the ones you expected. And that sometimes, when you gasp at the choices someone else makes, you are really gasping at the size of your own surprise. The discovery that life is larger than the stories you have prepared for it. The door of the Easton house opened and closed, and the light inside went warm and steady, and the Oklahoma territory spread out around it in every direction, as it always had, as it always would, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the kind of country that demands everything and gives back, to those who stay and work and love with full commitment. Exactly that.